In Romans chapter 8, the Apostle Paul talks about the freedom that we have in Christ. And yet, as is always the case, the concept of freedom doesn't mean without any kind of restraint. It doesn't mean there are no kind of rules or regulations that we're void of any responsibility because we're free. Now, freedom carries with it a tremendous amount of responsibility and its own set of guidelines. But notice what is stated at the very beginning of this chapter. There is therefore now no condemnation of those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of sin and death. There's that liberty. There's that freedom. We've mentioned before that when you consider what Jesus says versus what you find in the law of Moses, Jesus has elevated those concepts. The law of Moses dealt to a great degree with action. Jesus deals with the attitude behind the action. You get the attitude right, you're not going to have wrong action in connection with it. So the statement about liberty, verse 1 and verse 2, is followed up by the provision that we have in verses 3 and 4. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh on account of sin. He condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Here's verse 4 again. That the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Christians are concerned about attitude, the motives behind the action, the need to get the heart right, the need to be thinking correctly. And when that is done, those kind of actions that should not be taking place are avoided because of that heart and that mind that are focused upon God and his word. Verses 5 through 9 really involve a principle. Those who live according to the flesh set their minds on things of the flesh. Those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, that's not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. So that those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. If anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is not his. That principle is a recognition that if I'm thinking about things just from a purely physical background or reason or whatever, then I'm concerned about actions. If I'm thinking about the Spirit behind that, if I'm thinking about the Spirit of Christ, if I'm thinking about the motives that I need to possess, then I'm not physically driven. I am regulated mentally, intellectually, spiritually in the things that I do and what I want to accomplish. It's a contrast, but the contrast is well stated. That being the case, down in verse number 10, there's a possession that is ours as Christians. If Christ is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. Christ in you changes everything. Verse number 11, a promise. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. This life is not all that there is. With that promise comes some responsibilities. Verse number 12, therefore, brethren, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die, but if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you'll live. Attitude, heart, disposition of mind. We are indebted to God, not to live according to the whims and dictates of this physical world, but to focus our thoughts and our hearts on something that is greater. Down in verse 12 and 13, besides that debt, it follows with verse 14 through 16, we are children of God. We're in debt, the way that we live. Verse 14 and following. As many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. You did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. At the next point, verse 17, if we're children, we are heirs. There's an inheritance that is ours. And if that is the case, Why would I want to live based upon a law such as the law of Moses that focused on the actions that I do, rather than focusing upon something that takes care of the content in my heart, the motive behind those actions, the love that I have for God, that if that love is really present the way that it should be, the atrocities that are spoken against and condemned in those 10 commandments in Exodus 20 are never part of my life. And wherever something happens and we slip and fall, we stumble into being the kind of individual that God's not pleased with. If we reflect upon why that happened, we go back and recognize that we weren't thinking about the motives, we were thinking about the action. We were thinking about what would Christ do, we were thinking about what we wanted to do in the process. Somebody does something wrong to us and we want to retaliate. Would Jesus have done that? Years ago, you used to see in a very popular setting, especially among youth groups around the country, sometimes a little bracelet, sometimes maybe some other kind of reminder, but it had 4 letters on it, W, W, J, D. What would Jesus do? That's a phenomenal question that really needs to be on the lips and in the heart of the child of God every day. How would Jesus approach this problem? What would Jesus do if Jesus were the one responding to this? Or if Jesus was the one that was affected in this way? Or if Jesus was the one that had been the brunt of persecution? If Jesus were the one that people were talking about in false ways, what would Jesus do? We live by a different set of rules, things that you find based upon the life and teachings of Jesus, not the law that was given to the nation of Israel by God through Moses. We're not under the law of Moses. We're under the gospel of Christ. It makes a huge difference. Now, while Romans chapter 8 does not end with that concept, it's a great place from which to start as I take a look at the second half of Romans chapter 8. But those issues would be a different topic for a different time. Please take care. Please be safe. We'll talk again soon.